Still fantastic to have both of today's speakers on the topic of how you can operationalize normative notions in empirical work, and as a case study, the study of extremism. So let me briefly introduce both today's speakers before we get started. To my right is Dr. Juliette, who's an assistant professor in economics at the Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Groningen. She works on issues at the intersection of philosophy, economics, and sociology, such as social norms and social norm change, various values, and national identity. Her thesis was published in 2021, and it was titled Values, Culture, and National Identity in Economics. She also holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the Catholic University of Boudewijn in Belgium. Our second speaker is Professor Bruin, also from the University of Groningen, from the Faculty of Economics and Business, Professor of Financial Ethics, and he's also affiliated with the University of Göteborg. Right, I got it right this time then. In Sweden. Among his many research interests are epistemology, the epistemic program in game theory, political philosophy, financial crisis, and numerous other issues at the intersection of epistemology, ethics, psychology, and economics. His most recent book is the 2022 volume, the review volume, The Business of Liberty, Freedom and Information, Ethics, Politics, and Law. He was born in Almelo, yet funnier than the comedian Herman Vickers. Great to have you again. And now let's really get started. The floor is yours.
Good, thank you, Rick. So hopefully everybody can hear me loud and clear. Otherwise, please indicate this, and then I can try to adjust my volume. So thank you for inviting us today to present this actually draft version of the chapter that we're writing for your volume, your edited volume. And this chapter deals with the operationalization of normative notions, not specifically to the study of extremism, but I'm hopefully going to talk you through some of the issues that an interdisciplinary collaboration between, let's say, normative researchers and empirical researchers from whatever discipline they may be could face, and perhaps hopefully give you some useful guidelines on how to work through such issues. So I'm working together with Boudewijn, who's sitting to my right. So he's, let me see if I can go to the next slide. All right, page one. All right, so as a background, or let's say as a starter, I would like to introduce a hypothetical example that is not as hypothetical as it could be, because it actually draws on experiences of myself and Boudewijn, where I would be the empirical researcher, so I'm an applied economist, and Boudewijn would be the normative researcher. And this collaboration, this hypothetical real-life collaboration started in 2016 when I started with my PhD project, as Dick just mentioned, right? So this was on, let's say, the measurement of values, social constructs, drawing on theories from philosophy, social sciences more generally, such that economists could learn something from this. Right? I observed in many of the papers that I had to read during my studies that economists have a feeling of taking, let's say, easy approach towards measuring social things, and with social things, right, social constructs, identity, values, norms, etc. And that there might be many concerns that researchers from other disciplines might have, for good reasons, regarding these measures that economists adopt. And that was sort of the starting point for my PhD project, in which we embarked on, well, how could we find other ways to measure such concepts? And interestingly, right, so you start to collaborate on a project between a normative researcher and an empirical researcher, and having now had experience with multiple of such projects, some of which with Boudewijn, some of which with, for example, someone from the law faculty here in Amsterdam, which we collaborate together with as well, there are certain issues that these projects share. So there are certain phases through which you go and there are concerns, issues raised on which we would like to draw today. So just to give an example, so many of these collaborations oftentimes start with a lot of enthusiasm. Right? So the normative researcher, from their own background, they might have a lot of practical questions. Right? Questions regarding, well, I have this theory on a certain topic, I see things happening in society, and I would like to test or to see if my expectations can be, well, that they hold true, right? So if you think about conspiracy theories, believers in fake news, all these kind of questions, they would warrant perhaps a practical and empirical answer. So there's a lot of enthusiasm because working together with an empirical researcher, right, they have the tools and the knowledge on how to operationalize and indeed perhaps test or give an answer to these questions. In the first phase, typically these projects are they're met with a lot of enthusiasm. But then you start talking, you have several meetings, and quickly the normative researcher starts to realize that the empirical researcher has a very different approach towards measuring things, right? They want to see what kind of data is there. And then they would tell the normative researcher, well, we're limited with the data that is available. Setting out new experiments or carrying out new surveys will be financially costly, etc. Will take a lot of time. So the normative research might become a bit discouraged. They have a lot of ideas on what their ideal measurement or their ideal project would look like. And the empirical researcher at some point says, well, this is sort of the best we can do. Right? So we have to simplify, we have to make some assumptions, and then perhaps we could say something about this question. And that oftentimes leads to, well, causes some friction and might even lead to eventually both parties deciding, well, expectations are not met, so let's just stop the project or go both our own ways, or at least right, not to a successful ending of this project, which started off with a lot of enthusiasm. And so something that we observed is that sometimes, or maybe oftentimes, such interdisciplinary projects where empirical researchers and, let's say, normative researchers, right, so researchers working on normative topics, they may stay away from examining normative issues in an empirical setting for various reasons. Right? So the empirical researchers might just stay away from anything that remotely feels normative, because probably also difficult for them to remain, let's say, an objective ideal that they have of science. Right? Values should not influence our inference in some way. And normative researcher might stay clear from empirics for a whole set of other reasons when they are investigating normative concepts, which probably have to do with the fact that, right, an empirical researcher, right, will simplify issues, will in some way objectify things or try to objectify things that does not do justice to the normative issues and concepts that are important to this normative research. And we say, well, probably this leads to a stalemate, and this does not have to be the case. So we can actually learn something from each other, and it can be successful interdisciplinary projects with successful outcomes. And that will be the aim of today's presentation, right? So what we would like to do or to offer are a number of concrete suggestions that hopefully, right, would help us to overcome this stalemate that we observe and would allow for successful integration of both empirical researchers in an interdisciplinary environment, studying normative concepts, issues, and phenomena. Right? And normative, I will use that, let's say, for any or anything, everything normative that could be worthwhile to investigate. And so I will give some examples here and there, concrete examples to show you what I mean or what we visualize when we talk about certain projects, using several examples that draw on our own work. So that's the objective also for today's presentation. And so just to give you a bit of an outline, so I will start off with, let's say, a stylized representation of empirical work on normativity, normative issues, that consists of 3 elements. And then I will talk you through, or let's say introduce you to 2 well, maybe case examples of where we consider at least successful collaborations between normative and empirical researchers that draw on our own work. So it's maybe a bit of a boasting of our own work, but we consider it as well, somewhat successful, at least in several domains. One of which, for the first example that I will talk about, is the example of measurement of epistemic virtue and epistemic vice, work that Boudewijn has been working on. And another example that sort of draws on my PhD thesis, in which we attempt to measure national identity, drawing on social identity theory. And using these two examples, I will hopefully conclude in about 40 minutes or so with some practical guidelines on what could you do if you want to investigate normative issues in an interdisciplinary setting using empirical methods. So that's the outline. And so obviously there has been a lot of work in philosophy of science on research, science, social sciences, natural sciences. So it's by no means an attempt to sort of summarize all this research. But if we look at, let's say, the viewpoint of the empirical researcher, right, we still sort of talk about this hypothetical example of a collaboration between a normative and an empirical researcher. Then the empirical researcher typically, right, we could say that they subscribe to this fact-value dichotomy and argue that science should be value-free. This is not a novel idea, with the aim that science is there to deliver objective knowledge, right, very much drawing or inspired on the idea of the natural sciences, where we can observe and see natural objects that we can all objectively observe, right, and therefore also measure and experiment with. And this sort of ideal, when the social sciences started to arise, obviously was also the ideal of the social sciences, and particularly the economists have taken this, I would say, to an extreme form, with the idea, right, that, or following this ideal that science is there to objectively deliver knowledge, right? So the idea that context or individual judgments, values, beliefs of researchers as well as research subjects, they should not play a role in the way we conduct science. However, if we think about social sciences, which is typically the provenance of normative research or normative issues, then it can be very difficult to actually maintain this ideal of objectivity in science, particularly because these concepts, they are social constructs, right? Social constructs that we as humans construct. They cannot really be observed out there as natural objects. And therefore, this makes it very difficult, I would say, to do justice to normativity, right? There is some kind of tension between maintaining objectivity and also do justice to normativity at the same time. Because normativity as a construct, or let's say maybe a characteristic of social concepts, they are, let's say, value-laden, fuzzy, difficult to pin down, difficult to define, multifaceted, right? There's a lot of research or a lot of studies on that. And there is some tension between these characteristics and this ideal of objectivity that needs a clear demarcation of concepts, something that can be factually observed and therefore not influenced by values. And there are also a lot of, let's say, cautionary examples that warn us for the influence of values in, let's say, studying normative issues. So Oreskes and Conway have written several books on this. These are just a few examples. But for example, one of these examples that they discuss is the influence of tobacco and the oil industry in fabricating evidence that suggested that the risk of smoking and global warming are not as risky as other sciences would show. And so there's a clear influence of such industries and such stakeholders fabricating, let's say, evidence and not maintaining this objectivity ideal. Or another example, right, where also studies they showed the undesirable results or properties of drugs and certain types of foods. And there also at some point industrial interest started to interfere with these results, right, wanting to not publish them, for example. So also again, a clear, I would say, example that there are obviously instances where values do jeopardize this objectivity ideal that we uphold. And so as a consequence, what happens or oftentimes happens in empirical research, or what empirical researchers then choose to do, is that they either just avoid normativity altogether, right? So it's not going to be a topic of investigation, or right, they conduct some kind of research that might lead to normative outcomes, but they just sort of outsource the implications of this research to other parties like political scientists or the media, journalists, etc. And typically, or a normative researcher would not be very happy with this, especially if we think about, let's say, the latter part of this outsourcing idea. Because if you're going to conduct research, right, also as an empirical researcher, it's very simplified, or it's maybe too simple. It's very simplistic to think that you can conduct a study and do not touch upon normativity and then just leave the implications to other parties. If you do in a research project, you make certain choices as to how to define a concept, how to operationalize a concept, what kind of data to collect, what kind of methods to use, that are all influenced or may all be influenced by, well, obviously your own subjective perceptions, and might also have normative implications. Right? So eventually the outcomes of such a project may be or should perhaps be considered also from a normative point of view. And so for a normative researcher, they will have objections to, let's say, this consequence of sticking to this fact-value dichotomy that economists like so much. And so in the chapter, we try to sort of, grasp, or let's say, present a stylized view consisting of 3 elements that could summarize the objectives or objections that normative researchers could have to empirical research that deals with normative issues. And this view has 3 elements. First element is that the idea that empirical researchers construe normative concepts by factual concepts. We call that factualization. The second element is the idea that empirical researchers, they typically assess normative concepts through subjective experiences or experimental subjects, right? So they use survey methods or set up experiments to get a sense of the normativity involved in such concepts that they want to investigate. We call that subjectification or subjectification. And the third element is the idea that empirical research necessarily involves the simplification of normative concepts to some kind of, well, simplified version. We call that obviously simplification. So let me talk you through each of these objections, and I will give some examples here too to illustrate the idea. And so the first element, factualization, is the idea that if an empirical researcher wants to do something with normativity, they will probably find a way to reduce the normative element to something that is factual or descriptive. And so oftentimes this is done without any referral to normative vocabulary, arguments, argumentation, or justification. And I would say that a typical example of this is how economists deal with a concept like poverty. And so here there is a graph, or let's say a figure, which depicts from the 1990s onwards the share of the world's population living in extreme poverty by percentage. And you can see, right, so there's specific colors assigned to specific regions, right? So The yellow is sub-Saharan Africa, whereas the orange, also a very large part, is the East Asian and Pacific area. I'm not going to talk a lot about poverty today, but this is just an illustration to say that, right, economists, what they will do is they will find a certain threshold, typically a $1 a day threshold, to define poverty. And then you have a binary indicator, right? People are either poor or they're not poor. And we can make a very nice figure out of this, right? We can see how many people, relatively speaking, live in less or more poor regions. But obviously, I would at least say, and I hope that most, let's say, normative researchers agree with me, that this is a factualized representation of reality, right? Poverty is much more than either living on more or less than $1 a day, and it does not at all do justice to, right, the concept and the meaning of poverty, right? And then we don't even speak about the determination of this threshold, right? So what does it mean? What kind of threshold do we set in order to be able to claim that someone is poor? And there is a whole discussion that you can have about that. And typically, right, if you would choose a different threshold, the figure would be different. However, this is what we use to make policies. And so there is a whole, let's say, dimension that this figure does not tell by looking at a factualized outcome. And so that's the idea of this first element that we call factualization. So then let's go to the second element, subjectification. So the idea that if we don't choose to use, let's say, a factualized outcome, what typically empirical research will do to study normative concepts and to get at least a sense or, let's say, access to normativity is through studying the perceptions, opinions, or beliefs of experimental subjects or survey respondents. And so there's a lot of research in social psychology, sociology, political science, economics that uses survey research to examine what people sort of think, right? And this gives perhaps a better idea, or let's say access to normative considerations of these subjects. So survey experiments or experiments, and again, maybe just to give an example that most of you, well, I'm sure that you will know, right? Milgram's experiment in the 1960s was an experiment designed to see how people behave in an experimental setting where there is a clear authoritative figure, right, and whether people would follow up and are obedient to the orders of this authoritative figure. Obviously, at the time, this yielded a lot of interesting results for social psychologists, but morally speaking, right, there were also a lot of concerns related to the experimental setting. Right? Many of these, well, there may be experimental methodological concerns regarding the validity, the external validity of this experiment, right? Does this relationship also hold when we would set these people in, let's say, a real life setting outside of an experimental setting? But obviously there was also a lot of harm done, or questions at least, towards, let's say, the emotional impact of these experiments on these people, which again also raise a lot of other ethical questions about this. And so just to illustrate, right, the idea of using an experiment or a survey measure, which, well, ideally, or from an empirical researcher's point of view, gives us access to some feeling of normativity. Again, a whole range of other issues might arise in such settings. And then the third element, the element of simplification, the idea that empirical researchers, again, who do study normative concepts, they would simplify normativity into something that can be measured. And typically this does not fully do justice to the normative concept that we're studying. If we look at it as a social construct with many different dimensions, then if we're going to operationalize that into something that can be measured, simplification is typically something that you have to do, right? So you condense a concept with all its intricacies into, for example, a few questionnaire items, survey questions. Or you reduce that into an experimental setting where there is a very controlled setting to have a certain treatment. If you think about this Milgram experiment, But again, also that involves certain degrees of simplification, right? Because you simplify a very complex dynamic into a controlled experimental setting where you can push and pull a certain set of buttons to test and study a certain outcome, which does not necessarily reflect all the elements of the normative concept that you actually want to study. Another example, and so there's a lot of research in economics, political science on trust, generalized trust, as we typically call that. And to an economist, if you ask them, right, how do you measure trust or what is trust, then they will typically refer you to this questionnaire item. And so the question asks, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you cannot be, or that you need to be very careful in dealing with people? And then people are asked, survey respondents are asked, well, choose either of these two categories. Well, I hope that you see that, there is a lot of discussion on this question in economics in general, but typically, right, we could have a number of concerns on this issue, right? Trust, does this really, can we reduce that into two categories, that you either trust most people or that you need to be very careful, right? There are a lot of degrees in between these two categories. Or you can also raise questions on, well, does trust more fundamentally, right? Do we define trust as something that you have in most people, or is trust actually something that depends on particular people, particular actions, or particular situations, right? We think about trust, and I would say typically we think about, I trust a certain person, or I trust a person when they do certain things. And so this is not at all captured in this question, right? So even economists have a lot of discussions on this, but I would say that definitely that this is an example of how empirical researchers might simplify issues, right? To be able to do something with them in an empirical setting. So 3 elements, and I will try to, I will now go to 2 of the examples that we discussed in the chapter, to sort of highlight and use these elements to show how we maybe dealt with them. So the first example is work of Boudewijn together with Marco Meyer and Mark Alfano, published work on the development of a scale that allows us to measure epistemic virtue and epistemic vice. So that would be that's the first example that I will discuss. And so I don't know how much most of you know about virtues and virtue epistemology. So let me just give a very brief, let's say, introduction into the concept, right? So virtues, or the concept of virtues, goes back to Aristotle, right? Ideal or defined as character traits that people can acquire by acting in a virtuous way. And typically, virtues, we define them as the middle between a deficit and an excess. Sorry. So a good example would be courage, right? You might be a coward, that would be the deficit, and the excess would be that you are, let's say, overconfident in certain situations, right? And then courage would be the middle ground, where people that are courageous, they are fully or good or well equipped to deal with certain dangerous situations, right? They would not be too cowardice, they would correctly know what to do and to act in a courageous way. And so virtues can be acquired by acting in a courageous manner. And in the 1990s, this idea of virtues was extended into virtue epistemology by a number of different researchers. And the definition of virtues was sort of mapped onto epistemology, in the sense that now we could sort of define this as character traits that are linked to how we acquire, but also process and let's say transmit knowledge, as well as how we acquire novel information. And so typical examples would be virtues like curiosity, right? You can be curious to acquire new knowledge. You can be open-minded to new ideas. So there's a whole set of virtues, epistemic virtues, that was, let's say, developed in this line of virtue epistemology to understand conceptually how people deal with knowledge and new information. So at some point, this field started to grow, especially over the past few decades, because people started to observe developments in society linked to things like conspiracy theories, the arisal of new of fake news, of false beliefs that tended to grow with the time. And these were actually practical and perhaps more empirical questions, right? Because questions that, for example, arose. Can you still see the slides and hear the talk? I do think so.
Yeah, or just carry on.
Okay, all right. I'll just carry on. And so there were starting to arise more practical oriented questions, such as some of the ones that I listed here on the slides, right? So one of the most pressing and also more recently investigated questions are, for example, if we want to understand why people believe in conspiracy theories, then could epistemic vice or epistemic virtue play a role in understanding this? Or if we would be interested in combating beliefs in fake news, again, would there be a role for epistemic virtues, right? The idea that certain groups of people that are perhaps more epistemically virtuous or more or less epistemically virtuous, would they be more prone to believe conspiracy theories or to uphold fake beliefs in that sense? So practical and empirical questions that arose from this, let's say, more theoretical and normative field on virtue epistemology. And this is typically where you would have a collaboration between normative researchers and empirical researchers to commence. Okay? The normative researcher would have these questions, and they will be looking for someone that can, well, help them in sort of operationalizing and measuring, on the one hand, epistemic vice, right? We have this rich theoretical literature on virtues, on vice, on epistemic vice and virtue. We also have a whole literature on, let's say, conspiracy theories, conspiracy beliefs, and we would like to combine these two fields and investigate in an empirical setting whether the two could influence each other. And that may, I don't know, to some this may seem like an easy project. In practice, it's less easy than it might seem. So the first step, at least for Boudewijn and his co-authors, was to investigate whether there are any existing skills that could help them to answer these questions, right? Are there skills that allow us to measure epistemic virtue, epistemic vice, that could give us a sense of well, how people could be rated in terms of their epistemic vice or virtue performance, right? How do you think about that? How are you going to operationalize that? So there is a whole range of psychological skills that you would find in social psychology to measure specific epistemic virtues or specific epistemic vices, such as, for example, intellectual humility. So there's a lot of literature that develops skills that allow us to capture intellectual humility, which is the idea that you are, let's say, humble in sometimes acknowledging that there are certain gaps in your knowledge, right? You cannot know everything, and intellectual humility would capture that some people are, well, prone to at least acknowledge that you have these gaps in let's say, certain fields or domains. And there are existing skills, right? These have been tested and could be used. However, some of the downsides of these existing scales is that these scales, well, they were designed to measure intellectual humility only, right? So one epistemic vice on itself, and not a whole range of, let's say, who or which people are more epistemically virtuous or epistemically vicious. And so there was no general measure of epistemic bias, which would be something that they were interested in. Right? The idea that some people might be more virtuous than others. So a new measure or a new methodology, a new survey measure would need to be developed in order to answer these questions that I just wrote. Right? So can epistemic virtue, epistemic bias tell us something about why people believe in conspiracy theories, what they use? And they chose to use survey methodology for a number of reasons, right? So they would give us insight into how people believe, what do people think, what are their opinions, how do they approach knowledge, how do they acquire knowledge. A financial reason, it's typically survey methods are less expensive than an experimental setting. Designing an experiment is typically quite costly. And so it's, well, it might be a financial incentive. And on top of that, and I think this is an important characteristic or maybe an important advantage of working with a survey, is that it's much easier to generalize your findings. For a question relating epistemic virtue, epistemic bias to conspiracy theory, right, you would ideally have a sample that is representative of the whole population, right? You want to cover not just students that would participate in an experiment, but ideally you want to have the whole stratum of the population in your sample. You want to have older people, younger people, people living in cities, in rural areas, people voting for left-wing parties, right-wing parties, all kinds of people you would like to have in your sample, because then you really get a sense of how or who are the people that are prone to believe in conspiracy theories, are prone to be more epistemically virtuous or epistemically vicious, and therefore you have findings, in the end at least, that would allow you to really, so let's say, do justice to this idea of epistemic virtue and get a sense of well, how this really relates to conspiracy theories. And so survey methodology is the way they went. So I now show you, let's say, the list or the full list of survey items, survey questions that were eventually developed and asked. But obviously there was a whole process involved in going towards this list that drew on well, an inventory of the literature. What kind of virtues, epistemic virtues, would we be interested to measure, to capture? There are obviously a lot of epistemic virtues and vices that could be interesting in such, or from a normative point of view, if you are interested in explaining why people believe in conspiracy theories. And then the project starts, right? So you start to make an inventory, see what kind of concept you will be interested in, and then think of ways to capture these concepts in a survey item. To test this list of survey items, and then see how the survey items work when they are tested on a sample of people. And so this is the list, 10 items that they ended up with. I'm not going to go into this list too much. If you want, we can leave that for discussion later. What I do want to spend some time on is the answer scale that was developed. And that might seem a bit odd, right? So if we, for example, focus on the first question, right? I'm not very interested in understanding things, then this might capture an epistemic well, vice of, let's say, the opposite of open-mindedness, if I'm not mistaken. So it's an epistemic vice. But you need to sort of know how people, right? How do people position themselves if you ask them whether they are not very interested in understanding things, right? People might say, well, this is very much like me. I can find myself, or this reflects how I do things, or this does not very much reflect how I do things. And there was a discussion in the project group, right? Because if you go back to, let's say, the idea of an epistemic virtue or an epistemic vice, I just told you that an epistemic virtue can be defined as the middle between two axes, extreme positions, right? So a deficit or the excess. So that was also ideally or initially what the project started with, right? So this is an answer skill, a measurement skill, where people, if they are, well, they get one question, are you very interested in understanding things? And then people could either say, well, I'm not very interested in understanding things, I want to understand things, or I'm excessively interested in understanding things, where the middle option would reflect you are epistemically virtuous, right? That's the middle between the two extreme positions. Well, maybe, I don't know how you are feeling about this, but this didn't really work out well, and for a number of reasons. There are several methodological reasons why this doesn't work well. One of them is that people typically, and again, this depends on the type of sample you're investigating, some countries or some nationalities will be more inclined to always, irrespective of the content, choose the middle option. Whereas other people with different backgrounds, and there's again a lot of also empirical research on this, might be more inclined to choose for the extreme options. And so not necessarily capturing whether you're epistemically virtuous or epistemically vicious, but this is just the way that people respond with all those things, a response bias, right? A bias in how people respond. So from that, obviously the scale had to be adjusted, and eventually in the final version of the survey, the project group chose to just work, let's say, with this 10-item list, where they were defined as the deficit of a virtue, right? So let's say an epistemic vice. So instead of formulating, I am very understanding in things, they were formulated in, let's say, the negative keyed version, right? So I am not very interested in understanding things, or I'm not so interested in the reason why. And then people were asked to indicate, right, do you either strongly agree, neither agree or nor disagree, or strongly disagree? And this seemed also in practice to work much better. So typically, I can understand that you still have a lot of reservations, let's say from a normative perspective on this, but in practice, sticking towards this definition of epistemic virtue and vice, right? We want to know the middle defined by the two extremes. So the upper table worked less, or was much less efficient and effective than using this measurement scale that we see in the bottom of the slide, right? Because people were not as much busy with sort of these measurement issues, the biases that could result in this. So as a result, right? So they set up this survey and a representative sample of the population, and we had this final questionnaire that gave us information on how people could be, let's say, scored on different epistemic vices. Right? Either they were more or less vicious, depending on how they scored on each of these items. There may still be a lot of reservations, right? Because obviously this is a limited list of a number of epistemic vices, but still you might say, well, right, we have the answer scale was adapted. This allows us to at least capture some of the characteristics that theoretically epistemic vices should satisfy. But now the empirical researchers will step in and say, well, we have now a list of 10 survey items and the responses of a number of thousand people to these survey items. What are we going to do with this? Right? We wanted to have some kind of measure of epistemic bias, general epistemic bias. And it will be very difficult to relate each of these answers to conspiracy theories. Right? It will be a very complex and not very simple to understand analysis. So then what an empirical researcher might do is they will use a method called factor analysis. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with that, but this is a way to analyze a whole number of items, right? So in our example, we have 10 survey items. And the idea would be that there are some theoretical reasons why some of these items might be related to each other. So we call those factors. And here I drew 2 factors, latent constructs. So these latent constructs, they are not observables. So very much like this idea of a social construct, right? We cannot really observe epistemic virtue or epistemic vice, but we can design survey questions that allow us to say something about the epistemic inclination of people. And so we have our survey items, we know whether people are less or more, whether they agree to a lesser or greater extent, and we can use this empirical method to see how these answer patterns relate to each other, and therefore we can maybe say something about the empiric or the epistemic degree of epistemic virtue that is present in some of the respondents. So having done that, and again, there is a whole procedure for executing such a method in a correct way, gave rise to 2 epistemic vice dimensions, which the project, or which Boudewijn and his co-authors labeled as indifference and rigidity. 2 dimensions. Indifference, the idea or the vice sort of capturing whether people are interested in acquiring new things, right? Some people might be more indifferent towards new knowledge. And rigidity capturing the attitude that some people might be less, let's say, or more rigid in their thinking, less open towards adapting the way they think about things. And now actually the empirical researcher might be quite happy, right? Because they only have 2, a very simplified version of reality, but still departed or based on this list of 10 items that they can then use, again, a very big table, to see how these epistemic virtues and vices relate to other kinds of constructs. So for example, conspiracy theories, whether people are prone to believe in fake news, etc. So if you would like to read a bit more about this, I'm referring you to the paper. I won't go into this table too much, but this is just to give you a general idea on how this measure of epistemic vice was constructed and what kind of considerations were made. So let's turn to the second example. I don't know how much time we still have left. When did we start?
So we start a little later, so maybe 5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes, all right. So I won't go into detail too much here, but this is an example where of a project that I collaborated on at the the Netherlands Institute for Social Research. So in Dutch, it would be the Sociaal Cultureel Planbureau in The Hague. And this was a project that we embarked on to look into and to understand the Dutch national identity. Right? So this was a question that arose or has been actually for a long time of interest to a number of different fields. And so historians have worked on this, political scientists, sociologists, philosophers, so a whole scala of different disciplines. And I think the aim of this project at the SCP was to understand, well, what actually is the Dutch national identity? It has been a topic in the news for a long time, especially against the backdrop of a number of developments in Western society, right? Increasing polarization, electoral success of populist parties, decline of political trust. And the idea is, well, if we want to, does national identity and how people identify with their country, can that actually explain some of these developments? And more fundamentally, right, if we want to investigate that, then we obviously need some kind of measure on national identity and national identification, which at that point did exist, but not in the way that we would like it to be. And so another example of simplification, because if you start to look in the literature and the empirical literature on how people would typically measure something like national identity, again, we would feel, or we would ask a respondent, well, how close do you feel to, well, your town or city, your country, a continent, for example, Europe. And again, people would just be able to indicate whether they either identify very strongly or they don't identify at all. And obviously, this doesn't tell us anything about what this identity amounts to, right? What does this mean to people if they say that they identify with the Netherlands, right? What kind of aspects do they identify? So the measures that were existing were, at least for this project, right, wanting to understand what national identity amounts to, and also to do justice to all the intricacies of this concept on a theoretical, from a theoretical perspective. This project was embarked on, I think it was a 2-year project in which a lot of interdisciplinary researchers collaborated. So these were researchers from, all social sciences, let's say, was theoretical, empirical, etc. And one of the parts that I worked on was the design of a novel survey instrument that would allow us to say something about, how do people identify with the Netherlands? And if we talk about national identity, then what does it actually mean, right? So again, right, this project commenced. There was a very comprehensive literature review that was executed, interdisciplinary interviews with many different academic experts from different fields. There were focus groups in many different Dutch regions. And at some point, once there was a survey developed, a pilot study was also executed on a representative for the Netherlands. And the outcome of, let's say, all these interviews and focus groups was that a list of 185 questions were developed, where each question asked whether a certain characteristic of the Netherlands was something that people identified with. So they made it very concrete. Could be things like the Dutch flag, the Dutch national anthem, tulips, clogs, but also our institutions, let's say the welfare system, the pension system, freedom of speech, right? All were really a lot of alarm and I would say exhaustive lists of historical events, traditions, customs, etc. You name it, was included in this list. Normative researchers, if we go back to our hypothetical example, may be quite satisfied with this, right? Because it gives us a lot of information on all different aspects that might matter to different people, right? Some people might identify more with symbols or traditions, others with democratic institutions, for example. But for an empirical researcher, this is really, let's say, the nightmare, if you would have to do something with such a long list of items. And so this is just to give you an example of the survey. Right, so in the middle, you see some of the examples that some of the characteristics that we surveyed, right? The Dutch language, the Frisian language, dialects, the Dutch flag, and people could indicate, right, whether this would be something that they connected through. And that's what we eventually used. How to make something of this? So 185 questions, and we used another method, an empirical method that does not, sort of resembles factor analysis, but this actually uses the information at the extremes of a distribution of observation. So a very different, let's say, methodological assumption. And this algorithm starts to, let's say, classify all the individuals. You can maybe visualize them as a cloud of data points, right? Everybody has answered all these 185 questions. And based on your answer, you get a position in this 185 dimensional cloud, right? Obviously, very difficult to visualize. And this algorithm is going to look at extreme points in this data cloud that can explain all the individual positions in our cloud of data points. And this does that. It's an algorithm that it will just calculate this for themselves. And then, there's several tests that you go through to ensure that this is really the most robust and optimal outcome. And then we find that there are sort of 3 archetypes that are identified. We call them archetypes because the method is called archetypal analysis. And then we can interpret these archetypes, right, based on the characteristics that are most important to these respondents. Without going into much detail, and so we labeled them based on the characteristics of these groups of people and of the, let's say, answers of these extreme types, right? These extreme types that this algorithm explored and extrapolated from our data set. And we gave them labels. So there was a group of people that did not identify with any of these characteristics, call them indifferent. But there were also 2 groups of people, which we called ethnic and civic, based on the ethnic-civic dichotomy of Kohn. So this was work on how sort of nations can be characterized. And he would argue, well, some nations are more ethnic, others are more civic. And this has to do with the degree of openness to, for example, newcomers, but also how, let's say, what kind of characteristics are important to these nations. So ethnic nations, according to him, right, are nations that find traditions, historical, cultural heritage very important. And this civic type is much more a type that relates very strongly through the democratic institutions. Well, this is how we use these labels, and we explored how they would relate to things like attitudes, people's opinions. I won't go into detail here. If you want, we can discuss that later during the questions. And so to go to an end of this presentation, and so we consider actually these 2 examples, and we explain them into more detail in the chapter, as successful attempts of engaging with normativity in an empirical setting. But obviously, we also realize that even these examples are actually subject to a degree of factualization, subjectification, and simplification, right? We use survey methods, right? Subjectification is how we defined it. And also the methods of analysis that we used, right? They very much simplify the complexity of epistemic virtue, of social identity, into a limited number of types, right? Which was actually the concern that we started off with. So why do we actually see them as successful? Right, that has to do with a number of other characteristics. And we think that these characteristics can be valuable to other researchers. Right? So researchers that do want to do something on normativity in an interdisciplinary team of researchers. And that has to do with how the project is actually shaped. So first, practical recommendation: ensure that not just the empirical researcher executes the empirical part, but that this is something, a shared responsibility of both the normative and the empirical researcher. And so empirical researchers may make certain choices with their experimental or empirical knowledge in the back of their mind, but a normative researcher is very well apt to, let's say, remind the empirical researcher in which phases of the empirical design normativity should be taken into account. And then you actually get an empirical design, an empirical methodology that is much better equipped to do something with normativity than when the empirical researcher is going to design the project. That's the first recommendation. The second recommendation that also both of these projects actually did is to gain a broad understanding of the construct or the phenomena or the issue that you want to investigate by looking at relevant interdisciplinary literature. You can have interviews with academic experts from different fields, an overview of existing measures, and based on that, you start to look at, well, what kind of incremental changes and adaptations can we actually make to ensure that normativity is better reflected in the eventual operationalization of this construct that we're interested in. Third recommendation, so maybe a bit of an open door, but time and taking time to test an empirical design is very critical, especially in an interdisciplinary project. So obviously from, let's say, a psychometric point of view, right? The idea that a measure has to, well, meet certain criteria and certain properties, that's important. But also from a normativity point of view, I would say that this is really essential. I think the project of Boudewijn really clearly illustrates this, right? So they had this carefully designed answer scale that I discussed with you that met or matched how they defined and understand theoretically what an epistemic bias actually amounts to. But in practice, this did not function well, right? Many people chose, let's say, the middle outcome or the extreme outcomes without really understanding or reflecting the concept that they wanted to measure. So then you really have to think about, well, how can we adapt this? And obviously, there is time involved with this. And then the fourth guideline is, I think, the most interesting thing and let's say it's a bit of a surprise if this happens, but empirical projects that collaborate with normative researchers are most prone, let's say, to give rise to new and interesting theory that should be of interest to both parties, normative researchers and empirical researchers. And both projects that I presented today, they clearly, I think they are good examples of this. Right? So the project of Boudewijn, you never really expected to find these two latent constructs, right? Rigidity and indifference. This was not something that the theoretical literature could have proposed. And this was a very novel finding that again gives new insights into, well, how should we as normative researchers think about virtues and vices? Right? So that gives new avenues for theory building. Also, I would like to end here. So I hope that this will be something that fosters new collaborations between normative and empirical researchers. That was the aim, at least, of today's talk. So thank you for your attention.